So I think I have 0% of the time for 0% of the time for speaking, so I will be brief. So of course, thank you to Nancy and to Remy for inviting me to share this last session with our keynote speakers. Certainly, this is very important type of talk for colleagues at the World Bank, which I also invited to join, particularly to learning a lot about the implications of all this research for policy, particularly for the programs at the World Bank and your client countries. So please let me introduce then Professor Maisy Wong, who is the James E. Riadi Associate Professor of Real Estate at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a research associate at the NBER and an editorial member of the Journal of Urban Economics. So the title of the talk is on urban slums and development and the research frontier. So Maisy, thank you very much for joining us today, and you have the floor for about 20 minutes. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you very much, Carlos. And I just want to confirm I'm sharing my screen.
No, yes.
Okay. Right, great. Thank you very much for including me in the program. It was a pleasure to be here and see all this great research at the frontier this morning. And I only have 20 minutes, so let me start. I think we've heard this a lot already, but I think I still want to spend one slide on it, which is why are we here, right? In our discussions about how to promote productive, inclusive, and sustainable cities, slums has to be at the heart of it. It's home to more than 1 billion people. It's the entry point to cities for people in search of opportunity and urban mobility. You know, growing up in Malaysia and doing all this work in Indonesia, right? We certainly hear a lot of these stories, and now it's so nice to see all of this coming up in new data that's collected and real good scholarship. It's also a very complicated debate around land use, urban planning, infrastructure, because it entails difficult decisions around relocation and displacement of some residents with or without compensation. So the challenge for me is how to summarize all this really good research in 20 minutes. And so I'm just going to go to all these very good survey papers that summarize all this. I am going to focus on something that comes up a lot when I teach and also when I talk to policymakers, which is there's a lot of all this academic research. What really does it mean to me? I have to make a decision today or this before my election. What does this really mean? So what can we learn from academic research that can inform policy choices? So I'm going to frame this in using Durant and Venables, which I find to be a useful framework to understand how to think about the direct and indirect effects of place-based programs. Slums is about people, but a lot of as we saw today, right, a lot of these policies are slum urban renewal policies. They're place-based, so thinking about place is also really important. Right? So think about they have this checklist, right? This place-based paper. They have this checklist and on questions to ask, right? So what's the policy objective? What are the direct effects on treated places and people? What are the indirect effects from policy-induced responses of the private markets? Where here, as we have already seen today, right, a lot of these things can become actually important in spatial equilibrium, like externalities, credit constraints, coordination failures. They all end up maybe not showing up clearly, but if we think hard about equilibrium responses, those things end up mattering. The time frame, I think, also is really important. We're thinking about what's going to happen in the short run, what's going to happen over time. How long is long run, right? Some things are actually quite slow in developing countries. So you might clear the slum and it might stay vacant for a while, right? So there's some of these things come up. Thinking about the role of expectations matter a lot because a lot of these things are so lumpy. And so people make forward-looking expectations. So those things end up being important. And then of course, it's a workshop on urban inclusion, thinking about inequality, heterogeneity across groups. Those are important. So then my challenge is to think about, what are the actions or decision points, right, for policymakers. So I think that there are roughly about 5, there might be other policies I've missed out, but roughly about 5 that I hear about a lot in our discussion with policymakers about policy approaches related to slums. So let me focus on what we know, right, from slum clearance and public housing. I think they go hand in hand. Here, there's a lot of good work already. I'm not going to have time to summarize all of them, and of course, this sounds all very obvious, perhaps, right? When I talk to my non-academic family, right, they are like, "What? You didn't know this before?" It's obvious, but still, the quantitative magnitudes matter and the context matters. So I think relocating residents close by or to good areas is very helpful. It's very important for education, for jobs, sometimes not, right? So understanding all those is really important. We have important work from lotteries in Mumbai, Colombia, Cape Town in South Africa. Relocating them far away is actually complicated. In many cases, especially anecdotally, right, and also now in lotteries, you can see that they tend to be difficult. It's a big disruption, right? So many actually, even if they win the lottery, they end up never taking up. But then there's also some instances where some of them take up because there's value to it, and then they upgrade the homes. Okay. As I said, I don't have that much time, but I'm happy to share the slides for people who want to read more of these papers in detail. And then I have to also bring up the important work of Fernanda and her co-author from Chile that actually tracks, right, these displacements, these long-term effects of slum clearance on children, to really show that these displacement is very harmful. We have a lot of research about disruptions and moving costs being made, right? It's very well summarized in Banerjee and Duflo's Good Economics of Hard Times, in Brian et al.'s work on seasonal migration in Bangladesh. And then, sometimes you might end up, actually, like now I'm having some conversations with some policymakers where you have to build public housing and it's not going to be central, right? It's going to be a little bit far away. So then we also have work on person-based assistance we can provide, right? We have work from Simon and his co-authors on how to help people signal their skills, right? Helping them find jobs. We have papers on how to provide vocational training that can be helpful, right? So people have to be disrupted, right? How can we help them adjust, right? So there's work there. There could be more work, I think, on childcare and education, as has been pointed out. So those are all direct effects of slum clearance and relocating some residents nearby or far away. And then there are also now emerging evidence on indirect effects, right? So indirect effects, we've heard already many times, local spillovers matter. Actually, I think they matter in big ways in some places, and in other places, they tend to be actually quite localized. So understanding the quantitative magnitudes and the spatial decay, actually, I think is important. And then we have very nice papers by Turner and his co-authors on modeling the evolution of slums in Nairobi, where they have a nice model of developers forming expectations, right? Very similar to Michael's presentation as well, modeling developers forming expectations, where they have to incur fixed costs to expand formal supply. And so understanding this trade-off, which has come up several times already, on vertical tall buildings versus densification, because slums actually provide a lot of shelter to poor people, a lot of poor people. So Remy also has some work on this trade-off of vertical and horizontal densification. And then they had this nice example where in the example of like in Kibera, right, then they have their model allows them to quantify now this trade-off of, in some places, right, in some pockets where land values are very high, you could actually do a quantitative exercise to shed light or cast light on, at least you have some numbers to discuss that. Even after buying out slum blocks, because this is a setting where most people are renters, you can still have sizable gains that you can distribute to slum households, right? So there are pockets where you can start to have this type of discussion. And then there is newer work, which, maybe for a future conference, on long-term panels of slums in Chile, right, that will come, which is also very interesting, understanding, the substitutability between formal and informal housing. There's a role of informal housing when formal housing has limited supply. I talked about now all these indirect effects, which are very important. And then I don't have time, but if it's a big scale policy, right, this population resorting, which we saw from Milena's work, is very important. And so there are other papers that study these, that have more careful treatment of these building blocks of these equilibrium mechanisms, right, from the geckos and then from Xiao. There's also a recent paper by Alan Xiao on flooding in Jakarta, which also relates to slums and resilience and sustainability. In the remaining time, I did want to spend some time discussing a paper that Nina, my colleague Nina Harari and I have been working on, since my son is now 7, so as long as he's alive. So we've worked on this for a long time. I can spend 5 minutes on it, so I'm happy to talk about it more offline, but I did want to spend some time talking about it. So we studied this program called Campus Improvement Program, which is a very large-scale slum upgrading program from 1969 to 1984. It's a very famous program. We actually spoke to the program manager, who is also very kindly shared data with us. Just to give you a sense of the scale, all of this we know from all the good work done from reading program reports. Right, so this program, there are about 5 million beneficiaries, 11,000 hectares of land, or 25% of Jakarta. Just to compare, right? So the Mumbai Mills is 600 acres of land. This is 27,000 acres of land. So it's really a large-scale program. The program provided basic upgrades, 15-year verbal non-eviction guarantee, and there's evidence of that it stimulated private investments, right? So you pave the road, you provide drainage canals, you reduce flooding, people will improve their flooring. So there's a lot of papers and reports showing that there's good short-run direct indirect effects. So that's not something we're going to be able to improve upon. What we're trying to maybe cast light on or deepen our understanding on is this discussion you hear a lot about slum upgrading, which is, are there dynamic inefficiency concerns? And so what does that mean? So KIP was around 1969 to 1984. There's like a whole history of Jakarta in one slide. But over time, you can see that Jakarta has grown. It's about 10 million people in the city of Jakarta. So this is the city of Jakarta, but it's part of now 30 million in the metro area. So it's a very big mega city right now, and it's maybe starting to grow out of informality. And so there is a lot of evidence, I think, that KIP slum upgrading, right, delivers improvement in quality of life for many, many ultra poor people. And I think that is clear. And I would also say that short and medium run for the case of Jakarta was actually quite long, right? Partly because of perhaps this is not causal, but perhaps the Asian financial crisis in 1997. So we have now some work that shows that actually there wasn't much formalization, right? Building of tall buildings. This trade-off of vertical intensification is not really a big deal until like mid 2000s on onwards. So there's a good couple decades where there was no, I think, dynamic inefficiency concerns to the extent that we can understand. Okay, so however, in the long run, there is this concern that that slum upgrading actually encouraged the slums to persist longer than it otherwise would have. And again, here we have to clarify which perspective we're taking. From the residents' perspective of KIP, right? Of course, if I'm able to stay longer, that's good. Right? So it's good from the KIP residents' perspective. It may also be the initial objective of the government, right, of the program planner. And so these are all good. We are trying to take this view of what about from the social planner's point of view? Are there efficiency losses? And here's where we're going to, we don't have a strong view. We're open to any, we mostly want to try to do a good job in quantifying the trade-offs and really utilizing the scale of the KIP program to try and understand maybe where efficiency losses could be the largest. So what we do here is we actually benefited from a lot of good data that the Jakarta government shared with us. So we stitched together this very high resolution policy map and then collected very granular prices and quantities data for both formal and informal areas so that we have a representative accounting of what happened to formal areas and what happened to informal areas. So that's in a few slides. There's a 100-page paper, but in a few slides, this is the spirit of what we're doing. So we zoom in. So here we can see, right, the polygons are the KIPP areas. And then the gray areas are basically compounds that are just the slums that were before KIPP, they existed before KIPP. So here what we do is our thought experiment is we look at places that were compounds or slums before, and then we compare places that were compounds before that were treated by KIPP, and then places that were not, right? So the upgrading was discontinued because of a oil budget shock, negative oil budget shock. And so here we can see that fast forward to today, which is a couple decades. So this is about 2015 is where most of our data comes from. So we measure land values from assessed land values data from the government. We measure building height using our own photos that we collected from Google Street View and also our own field photos. And then we also code the quality index or degree of informality. So blue is very informal, red is blue is very formal, red is very informal. And so the gist of it is that in the long run, right, you do see that non-KIPP places have formalized and then KIPP places have stayed informal. So have lower land values and shorter buildings and stayed informal. But actually, here's where we utilize the scale of the KIPP program to really look at heterogeneity. And so this is first looking at prices per square foot. So just prices, so land values per square foot. And you can see here that actually there's a lot of heterogeneity. And in place here, we're ranking them based on predicted land index. And here's maybe like the CBD. You do see that the largest losses, gaps in land values, right, is in the highest quintiles, right? But in the other places where, actually Jakarta has not really formalized yet, you still see actually after a few decades that there is this pretty persistent benefits. That's just on prices. Because it's been brought up, right, that there is this trade-off of vertical and densification, you have to really also count for the quantities of it. So we also look at the volume of built-up space. And here is where you also see that here we're plotting the number of buildings for 1 floors, 2 floors, KIPP and non-KIPP. And the gist of it is that, yes, KIPP has fewer tall buildings. However, actually, another part of the data that disciplines, our discussion is that a lot of non-KIPP places do not have that many tall buildings. So a lot of Jakarta is really not that tall, right? And so, when you're trying to put together like the total surplus, just in a reduced form exercise from the social planner's point of view, you have to be counting prices, right? If a place stays informal, land values are lower, right? When you formalize, yes, land values go up, but and you can build taller, right? So it's just about how much taller, because you are displacing, right, a lot of people in informal places. So there is a meaningful trade-off, and we do this exercise across all of Jakarta just to quantify it in a reduced form exercise, right? And that's how we get to this idea that actually most of the losses from the reduced form part is actually very concentrated. Okay, so this in these places is, if you will, very similar to like the pockets like Kibera or the Mumbai mills. It's very, very central areas where maybe, you can have this trade-off be meaningful, but in other places it doesn't look like, right? The formalization, right? The gain is going to be large enough, right, to account for displacing all those people. So that's kind of the exercise we try to do. We are in the middle of a major revision, so we'll share a little bit more. But I do want to at least say also that because we are in this setting of weak property rights, the lower land values we find in KIPP places do not really mean lower welfare for KIPP residents. It's really because the people, so you have some upgrading that improve land values. Over time, the KIPP places stayed informal. When the non-KIPP places are formalized, yes, land values go up, but the non-KIPP residents that were kicked out, right, they don't show up in the prices, right? So this is this weak property rights setting, because the developers by law in Jakarta, they do not have to compensate those people who were kicked out. Right, so just looking at prices, right, of the formal places also is really not a complete picture. And that's what we try to do in our exercise, is to put together prices, quantities in both formal and informal areas, right, to paint a better picture. In our future current extension, right, we also try to, we're doing more work on equilibrium effects. So what happens if you take a kid neighborhood and you formalize it, people will resort, right? So we will look at this direct and indirect effects. So we look at, you formalize places, you expand supply of formal housing, rents will fall for the high skilled. You contract supply, rents will increase for the low skilled, the poor, right? They get displaced to the periphery, they are harmed, right? So how do we account for all of that? And then as you upgrade more, or as you formalize more places, right, there will be indirect effects from prices and quantity responses throughout the city, and then population resorting, spatial linkages, and all the spillovers from neighbors who are high skilled. So this is what we're doing right now to account for all the different mechanisms and channels that you've also heard about. And that's work in progress. Slum upgrading on site, I think, is also very often compared to site and services. So let me spend a minute here. There's a very nice paper by Tanner and his co-authors as well to show that long term, right, there are great benefits from site and services. So then, like, what does this mean for somebody who's choosing slum upgrading versus site and services? I actually think that the two papers are very much saying similar. I have similar takeaways from both papers, right? Which is that it really depends on what your options are as a policy or practitioner, right? So if you have land, the site and services paper says, yes, long-term, site and services has great benefits, great investment. If you have land that is available, you're able to target the people, right? If there's no very high minimum lot sizes, you have the political stability, so you actually can plan ahead. There's no change in government, right? There can be benefits from site and services. Slum upgrading too, I think, has great benefits, right? We show that in many places, it makes sense to do slum upgrading. But there are some other places where we have to maybe think about dynamic inefficiency. And here again, right, the time frame really matters, right? So the dynamic inefficiency may not actually show up, and maybe if it shows up, it really only shows up in a few places. So thinking about direct effects, indirect effects, time frame, I think helps a lot, at least when I teach, like helping students understand like when to do what, right? How to design, right? All those details matter. Tiling, I will not have time to talk about tiling, right? Like 0 minutes. Yeah. So there's a lot of great work on tiling, including at the bank. Tanner has a great paper there. I will skip tiling, and then so let me take 9 minus 2 minutes. Let me take some time though. I do want to spend some time to think about like what does this all mean for practitioners and policymakers. Right, today we are urbanizing and under very challenging conditions. We have limited resources, but the stakes are high, and I think we are accumulating good academic research of all the good work done in people in this room, including and the bank too. On like and so therefore like the stakes are high, and therefore all policies I think have to be on the table, right? We now know, right, some of the costs and benefits of slum clearance, relocation, public housing, slum upgrading. I will also add this other very ambitious policy in Egypt that is subsidizing in the private market side. So like I put this in my midterm question, and students ask, what does this mean? What's the best thing to do? I think it really depends, right? So if you can subsidize the private sector to offer supply and subsidize demand, if you have all the capacity to do that, all stars are aligned, that's a good thing to try. If you can do large scale titling, right, that also has benefits, a good thing to try. You have land available and you're able to target it at scale, right? It's also there are benefits. Some upgrading your costs and benefits, some of the costs show up later on. And then we have all this good work that I've already summarized on slum clearance and public housing. I think all of these are on the table, and I think a lot of the things we're learning is about the details on how it's designed, the local context, and all this emerging evidence. And it's great to see all this growth. And so let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maisy, for a very interesting presentation. And next for discussion and policy discussion, we have Judy Baker, my colleague at the World Bank. She's a global lead for urban poverty, inclusive cities, and housing. Thank you, Judy. You have about 8 10 minutes.
I thought it was 10.
Speaking of that.
Okay, so no slides, and I'm just gonna try to be brief here. So first, I want to thank you, Maisy. That was really a really nice framing and summary of all the recent literature. A lot of it I hadn't seen before, so it was really again in such a short time you packed in a lot. And the work that you're doing on the KIP program and the part of looks super interesting. I definitely want to read the paper. There's a lot of interesting implications there, and I've worked myself in Indonesia for a long time, so very curious to see that. So I think the policy tools that you presented are the same ones that I would have put out there. And they're the ones that are used by most governments and development practitioners, with different emphasis in different countries. So I'm going to offer just a few reflections, very much from a policy practitioner point of view, not so much from a research point of view, but I think with some implications for the research agenda. With also the overarching goal really about finding solutions for low-cost housing in developing countries. And also highlighting the last point that you made, that there really is no one size fits all. All of the countries that I've worked in, usually we have a package or a basket of solutions that we offer. And, depending on the circumstances and conditions, you have to kind of pick and choose. So a few reflections specifically, and I'll just go through your points on the slum relocation. I think that, the studies provide new and robust evidence, which is helpful from a policy perspective. I think for what we've known from a long time, that slum relocation can create a lot of negative externalities. And our general perspective has been that this is something that's really a last resort. When we have to go into communities, the idea is to try to keep them together. Sometimes you can't, if people are at risk, you need to move them out. So then how to do it, making sure that, you have access to good transport, to jobs and services, and maintaining a sense of community. And I think a lot of this research is just emphasizing that. On the issue of public housing, so we heard earlier, heard some of your summary of this. I mean, I think there's a lot of failed attempts that we've learned from over time. I know for the work that we're doing in developing countries, the big challenge is trying to find models that are attractive for the private sector, that can tackle financing side of things, the operations and maintenance, and then some of the social issues that we know historically have linked to, challenges with ghettos, and other implications. Under this category, I think it's actually one of the areas that we still, don't know that much about and really needs to be sort of deepened, is opportunities for rental. The rental markets is generally a little bit misunderstood or not fully understood in developing countries. And I think there's a lot of areas for potential research there. There's some interesting work in South Africa on backyarding, where people are sort of taking their plots, they're building extra housing, and it's turning out to be a win-win for low-income residents as well as for those who own the properties. It's a way to have supplemental income. On informal settlement upgrading, so we have decades of experience. It's something I myself have worked on for a long time in the bank. And the couple of pending issues that I didn't hear as much about, and I think again are still important for the research agenda. First of all, is how do we make sure that upgraded neighborhoods have better integration with the city, and that they don't become just pockets of sort of more established settlements, but then don't integrate with jobs and services in the rest of the city. And then, of course, the biggest one is how to go to scale. And this is something that we have not really solved. There's a couple of countries that have done it pretty well, but for the most part, we just haven't been able to get there. And I think it comes back to an issue around political economy. So, most governments are a little bit hesitant about upgrading. They feel like it's going to attract more and more people into slums if they make the conditions better. And so they are reluctant to do it. So on this issue around political economy, I think we need to do more research. I think there's a lot of opportunities for better understanding what motivates local governments, national governments, and maybe again more demonstration about positive impacts over time of upgrading. Okay, then moving on to sites and services. So I wanted to also bring in a paper in addition to the Tanzania paper, which I had a chance to scan through. It was terrific. Also wanted to mention work that my colleagues have done in 2016, looking at, it's called Success When We Deemed It Failure, Revisiting Sites and Services in Mumbai and Chennai. So that is by Owens, Fuliani, and Frisbee. And what's really interesting there is that the paper actually went back to a site after 20 years to look at what happened. And they found these thriving neighborhoods. And it was, I have to say, at the World Bank was a little bit controversial because the bank had moved out of the whole development world and moved out of the business of sites and services based on what I think was some flawed research. They had done evaluations very soon after these projects finished, and they found that they weren't that successful. And so everybody stopped funding sites and services projects. So when I started working more recently in Africa, kept asking, look, this is, the need for low-cost housing is enormous. I mean, it's still at a relatively low stage of urbanization, also in South Asia. And it's not going to be solved by slum upgrading or social housing. You need to, look around and do greenfield development. So we have taken a fresh look at this whole area of sites and services, more from a technical perspective, from an internal World Bank, what can we do, to do these projects? And, so we've got this new review piece that just came out and about a year ago, and we're starting to get some traction. There's a lot of interest in doing more sites and services projects. And of course, it's not easy. You've got to find land, you've got to solve the titling issue, you've got to figure out the financing models. But I think, it's an important area, and I'm glad that you raised it. Then finally on land titling, I too didn't have a whole lot to say, except that it's probably among the hardest things that we do. And it's probably one of the biggest bottlenecks that we have to upgrading. And I think we need a lot more evidence over time about, and of course, the way we've approached it is there's a big gray zone of how we do titling. So, everything from every country looks at it a little bit differently. So I think there'd be some definite areas for more research to look at the benefits over time, and especially from a property tax perspective, to try to make, again, a good cost benefit analysis to policymakers about why it's valuable. So in addition to the points that I raised on political economy and rental and the other points, there's two more that I wanted to raise where I think, again, the policy and research nexus would add some value to the work on slums, slum upgrading, low-cost housing. So the first one is on migration. So I think what we are seeing in many of the countries, I've just been working a lot in the Sahel, but it's happening in a lot of places. You're seeing a rise in climate migration. So I think more and more people are going to be coming to cities. So if we can get a better handle on this about, the decisions that they make about where they're going, where they settle, how we can avoid future slums and keep people out of harm's way, maybe learning from some of the lessons that we already know, how they can access livelihoods, the aggregate economic impacts. These would all be things that I think are increasingly helpful for the work that we do in cities and on local communities. And then finally, on the costs of slum upgrading. So we have a number that is looks at some cost benefit analysis about why it's better to invest upfront rather than go back and upgrade later. But the number, we tried to track down the source of that number. We've never been able to find it. So somebody needs to look at this and I think refresh the information base on it, try to get a good handle really on this cost benefit aspect of slums. That would be super helpful. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. So I think we have time for some questions, maybe 3, and just I think we have one online that
It's actually for Judy about what the gray area is. So what is the gray area entitling? So we can talk about that.
Thank you. So any other question in the room? Yes, over there, please.
This question is for Judy as well. As far as President Biden's new mortgage fee, well, I know this is domestic, it's not a national fund. As far as the new mortgage fee that he's implementing, can you just comment on what you think are the ramifications of that, positive or potentially negative? And also, could something like that be done on the rental side as well?
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Yes.
So this question for Judy. So you mentioned this issue of local governments not wanting to invest in upgrading because they're concerned about attracting people. Can you talk a little bit about like what are the mental models that that local governments have in mind in terms of what question would they like to have answered empirically that would maybe affect their opinion about it?
Thank you. So I think that's sort of questions in the room. There is one online that asks that in the context of climate change, to what degree is green technology incorporated in informal housing, and if applicable, any impacts on cost diversification. Okay, I don't know. There were a lot of questions for Judy. Maybe you want to respond, and we can give the last word. Yes.
Okay, so I'll start by saying, I'm sorry, I wouldn't be able to answer your question very well because I don't really work on domestic issues, so yeah, sorry. On the titling issue, so there's this notion, at least in some places where having a formal title, that is completely registered and ticks every legal box is what is the ultimate goal. But I think what we have found in the upgrading process is that there is this, gradation of formality that is acceptable. So giving some people some sense of security of tenure will incentivize them to invest in housing improvements, for example, but that doesn't have to be formal title. And so, like I said, in every country, there's sort of this process where you start with something that's more than completely informal to something that's 100% formal. Hopefully that clarifies. Michael, on your question, so it's a great question. It's like, yeah, what would it take, really? I think in the, discussions that I've had with local governments, a lot of it comes down to cost. And, if they can understand, goes back to, I was saying, having some good evidence about, what the benefits over time could be from a property tax perspective are useful. And, just some good cost benefit analysis and I think the only way you can get at that is, with time. It's not something that this is always the problem with doing research and impact evaluations and slum upgrading projects is that, in a 5-year time span, which is typically what a World Bank project is, there's no way you can capture those longitudinal benefits. So you really need the research community to come in or find another way to be able to pick up and capture impacts over time. And the online question was,
Just, it was on the green technology incorporated.
yeah, so I didn't know much about it, but we did, actually, there is a paper that colleagues just completed looking at how, with slums, we typically think more about resilience. But we did just look at how you can use sort of low carbon approaches to do upgrading. And some of it is, of course, just the spatial aspects, but then there are also new technologies and how they're being implemented. There's some great work done in Argentina right now in low-income communities, specifically on low carbon technology. Thank you.
And messages, I mean, there were a lot of easy questions on the political economy, the climate migration, the cost benefit. I don't know what is your take on those.
Maybe
Thank you so
I'll
much.
just take a minute to just say that I think I'll just reinforce, I think that by definition, what's very encouraging, I do think, like coming back to some of these discussions we've been having with local governments, is that more and more so, I think governments are doing data-driven decision making, and they're looking for what are the lessons. And so a lot of this academic research about, in the short run, this is what we see, but actually in the long run, you come back, this is what we see. I think these are all very encouraging, and by definition, slums is informal, so they're not formally in the database, but we're seeing more and more good data tracking people over time, like more migration, movement of people. All of this is great, and I think encouraging more of the growth in this intersection is this type of conference is just really valuable, I think, to people like me, and so thank you very much for organizing it.